I remember the exact morning he came for them. It was Tuesday, October 4th, 1983. A cold front had pushed down from Canada overnight, and the air was thin and sharp, smelling of wet dust and dying leaves. The sky was the color of old tin, flat and unforgiving. I remember because I just finished milking our last cow, Daisy, and the warmth of the milk pail against my frozen fingers was the only comfort in a world that felt like it was freezing solid around me. That's when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive, a sound too heavy and deliberate for any of our neighbors. It was Mr. Sterling, the bank president, in his dark blue Lincoln. He never drove out to a place himself unless the news was final. My husband, Thomas, had been gone 2 years by then, and the weight of the farm, the notes, the decisions had settled squarely on my shoulders. I knew what the sound of that car meant. It was the sound of the end. He thought he was buying sheep. What he was really buying was his own undoing 6 years down the road. He just didn't know it yet. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Mr. Sterling got out of his car, pulling the lapels of his city coat tight against the wind. He wasn't a cruel man, not in the way people think of cruelty. He was worse. He was indifferent. To him, my flock of 200 Rambouillet ewes, a flock my grandfather had started in the 20s, was just a column of numbers in a ledger, a depreciating asset. He walked with me to the paddock, his polished shoes sinking a little into the damp earth. The sheep huddled together, their breath making little clouds in the cold air. They were good stock. Strong mothers, good frames, hardy. Thomas and I had worked our whole lives to maintain the line. "It's a shame, Martha," he said, his voice smooth and professional. "A real shame. But the markets are what they are. The operating loan is past due, and the board, well, their hands are tied." I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Arguing with a banker about finances is like arguing with a stone about softness. He already had the auctioneer lined up. Dale and a few other neighbors were coming later to help load them out. They'd get a few dollars ahead for their trouble. The bank would take the rest. He looked at the flock, a quick, dismissive scan. "We'll get $60, maybe $65 ahead for the prime ewes. The lambs a little less. It'll clear the note. That's the important thing. You'll be free and clear. Free and clear of everything I had." I knew what the auction would bring. Pennies on the dollar. He knew it too. It was a buyer's market, and he was the only buyer that mattered. He was planning to buy the best of them himself, through a holding company, and start his own hobby flock on the big acreage he'd just bought out on the highway. I'd heard the talk at the feed store. "What about the culls?" I asked, my voice flat. There were always a few who were older or smaller, or had some small fault that took them out of the prime breeding pool. He gave a little shrug. "We'll be lucky to get 20 for them. Frankly, it'll cost more in transport and auction fees than they're worth. You can keep them if you want. A little flock to keep the pasture down." He said it with a thin smile, a gesture of charity that cost him nothing and was meant to make me feel the full depth of my failure. He was leaving me the scraps, the ones nobody wanted, the difficult ones. That afternoon was one of the longest of my life. I stood by the fence and watched as my neighbors, men I'd known since I was a girl, helped the auctioneer's men sort and load my life's work onto a fleet of stock trucks. They were quiet, ashamed to look me in the eye. They were just doing a job. Dale paused by the gate on his way out. "Sorry, Martha. I truly am," I just nodded. When the last truck rumbled away, the silence it left behind was heavier than any noise. The pasture looked huge and empty. All that was left was a small knot of 27 ewes, huddled by the water trough as if they knew they were the last ones left. They were the ones with patchy fleece, or who were a bit too lean, or were past their prime birthing years. They were the farm's history of mistakes and hard luck, all gathered in one place. Mr. Sterling had taken my herd. He'd left me the trouble, my difficult ground. 27 unwanted sheep on 160 acres of land that now felt like a desert. For almost 2 years, that's all they were. A reminder. I did the chores on autopilot, feeding and watering them, moving them from pasture to pasture. I took a part-time job clerking at the hardware store in town to pay the property taxes and keep the lights on. The farm was quiet. Too quiet. Some nights the loneliness was a physical presence in the old house, sitting in Thomas's empty chair. The 27 U's were a chore, a burden, a living monument to my failure. I thought about selling them off more than once, but the $20 a head I might get seemed like a final insult I couldn't bear. Then came a rainy Saturday in the spring of '85. I was cleaning out the old roll-top desk in the study, a piece of furniture that had been my grandfather's. It was full of old receipts, dried-up pens, and papers that hadn't been touched in decades. In the back of a deep-bottom drawer, my fingers brushed against something hard and smooth. It was a small book, a shepherd's flock book, bound in dark green leather, cracked and worn at the edges. The cover was embossed with a single year, 1934. I opened it carefully. Inside, in my grandfather's elegant, deliberate script, was a complete record of his flock from that year. But it was more than just numbers. In the margins, next to the columns for birth weights and breeding pairs, he had written notes. Pages and pages of them. Observations about the weather, the quality of the hay, the behavior of the rams. And notes about the wool. He was obsessed with the wool. You number 114. One entry read, "Daughter of old Ben. Fleece is coarse at the shoulder, but the staple is 5 inches long. Good density. Breed to the Morrison ram." Another said, "Sheared late this year, May 12th. Allowed the grease to rise. Fleeces are heavier, but the crimp is more defined. Less breakage." I spent the entire weekend reading that book. It was like hearing his voice again after 30 years. He wasn't just raising sheep for meat the way everyone did now. He was cultivating fiber. He wrote about micron counts and tensile strength, about the subtle art of letting a sheep's diet and the timing of the shearing determine the quality of the fleece. He was breeding for something slow, something that took patience. And on the inside cover, in faded blue ink, he had written a single sentence, a rule he must have lived by. It was the key to the whole book, to his entire philosophy. He'd written, "The value isn't in what you shear off, it's in what you leave on the bone." I read it once, then twice. It wasn't about getting the heaviest fleece at shearing time. It was about the animal itself. The genetics, the health, the bloodline. It was about leaving the best animals in the flock, even if they were smaller, even if they didn't look impressive. It was about building quality slowly over generations. The modern way, the way Thomas and I had been forced to practice to keep up with the banknotes, was all about speed. Big, fast-growing lambs that could be sold in the fall. Heavy, coarse wool that was sold by the pound to a regional co-op, all of it thrown together and graded as generic medium-grade fiber. Mr. Sterling's way. The way of the spreadsheet. My grandfather's way was the opposite. It was a system, not a trick. A long, slow conversation with genetics and grass. And as I read, a strange thought began to form in my mind. The 27 U Sterling had left me. They were the culls, yes, but they were culls by modern standards. They were the smaller ones, the slower-growing ones. They were the ones whose genetics were closest to the flock in this book. They weren't a monument to my failure. They were an inheritance, an opportunity. The idea was terrifying. It would take years. I had no money, no help. And for what? To try and revive a method of sheep farming that the world had decided was obsolete? Felt foolish. I closed the book and put it back in the drawer. For weeks, I tried to forget about it. I went to my job at the hardware store. I did the chores. But the words from the book echoed in my head. What you leave on the bone. One evening, my brother-in-law, Elias, stopped by. He was Thomas's younger brother, a quiet, steady man who worked as a welder at the implement dealership. He never said much, but he saw everything. He'd been coming by once a month since Thomas passed, just to check on things, fix a leaky faucet, or help me patch a fence. He never offered pity, just practical help. He found me out by the paddock, just staring at the little flock. "They look healthy enough," he said, leaning against the fence next to me. "I suppose," I said. "I was thinking of doing something different with them." He waited. He was a good listener. "My grandfather," I started feeling foolish. He used to breed for wool. Finévole. Not the stuff we sell by the pound. Something else. I told him about the flock book, about the notes, about the aphorism on the cover. I expected him to tell me I was crazy, that I should sell them and move to a small apartment in town. He was silent for a long time, just watching the sheep graze as the sun went down. The light went orange and flat, the way it does in early summer. Finally, he spoke. "What's the first step?" he asked. It was the most practical, most hopeful question anyone had asked me in years. It wasn't a judgment or a warning. It was an invitation to begin. "I have to know what I have," I told him. "I have to handle every one of them, really look at their fleece. And I need to fix the old shearing shed. The sorting pens are all rotted out. I've got some scrap steel at the shop," he said. "And there's that pile of old oak boards from the hayloft. We could probably build what you need." And just like that, the work began. That summer of '85 was the summer I started reading the ground. Or in this case, the sheep. I spent every spare hour I had with that little flock. I didn't just look at them. I studied them. I used a staple puller to take small samples of wool from their shoulders, their sides, their breech. I'd bring the samples into the house at night and look at them under my old reading lamp with a magnifying glass. I washed them gently in little bowls of warm water with a bit of soap, teasing the fibers apart. What I found was astonishing. The wool was inconsistent, yes. Some of it was coarse and hairy. But on about half of the ewes, hidden beneath a weathered outer coat, the wool underneath was different. It was finer, softer. It had a tight, uniform wave to it, what my grandfather's book called a deep and righteous crimp. These were the sheep that carried the old bloodlines. They were smaller, and they wouldn't win any prizes at the county fair for size. But their fleeces held a secret. Mr. Sterling, in his haste to claim the biggest and best-looking animals, had left me the genetic heart of the flock. The problem wasn't a problem at all. It was a misread resource. The system described in the book was meticulous. It wasn't one single thing. It was a dozen small, connected things. First, the grazing. Grandfather had a strict rotation schedule, moving the flock to fresh pasture every 3 days. He believed that the constant access to fresh, nutrient-rich forage in its early growth stages had a direct impact on the fineness of the wool fiber as it grew. So I started dividing my big pasture into smaller paddocks using temporary electric fencing. It was more work, moving them constantly, but I followed the book. Second, the culling. I had to be ruthless, but in a new way. I wasn't culling for size anymore. I was culling for touch. I identified the 12 ewes with the finest, most consistent fleeces. They would be my foundation. The other 15 I would sell. It was a hard decision, cutting my tiny flock in half, but the book was clear. Concentrate the genetics. I sold them to a neighbor for a little more than Sterling had offered. $30 a head. The $450 I got paid for the new fencing energizer and a few rolls of wire. Third, the breeding. The book specified using a ram that was slightly smaller but had an exceptionally fine fleece. Finding one was nearly impossible. Everyone was breeding for big, meaty rams. I spent a month calling breeders all over the state. Finally, I found an old man down in the southern hills who had a small flock of purebred Rambouillets from an old line. He didn't advertise. He was just a hobbyist. I drove down there with my stock trailer. The ram was small, almost delicate looking, but when I parted his fleece, it felt like silk. He cost me $300, almost everything I had left. It was a huge gamble. The quiet work of preparation took 2 full years. Elias came over on weekends. Together, we rebuilt the sorting pens inside the old shearing shed. We didn't have money for new lumber, so we used the oak boards from the hayloft. They were hard as iron and warped with age. We had to drill every nail hole. We built a series of narrow chutes and gates, a system that would let me sort the sheep one by one into different pens based on my evaluation of their fleece, just as my grandfather had described. Elias welded new hinges for the gates from scrap metal. The total cost in cash was less than $50 for nails and bolts. The cost in sweat was immense. I built a skirting table, a big screen of wire mesh stretched over a wooden frame. After shearing, the fleece would be thrown onto this table, and I could pick through it, removing the coarse belly and leg wool, any vegetable matter and any second cuts. The commodity market didn't care about skirting. They just weighed the whole bag. But for fine wool it was essential. Everything I was doing was the opposite of the modern, efficient world. It was slow, laborious, and small. During this time, I saw Mr. Sterling occasionally in town. He'd be at the bank or the post office. He'd give me a polite, distant nod, the kind you give a person you barely remember. Once, at the feed store, he saw me loading a few bags of mineral supplement into my old truck. "Still tinkering with those few sheep, Martha?" he asked, a touch of amusement in his voice. "Keeping busy, are you?" "I am," I said, and nothing more. The condescension was a familiar weight. It was the same tone he'd used the day he took the flock. The institutional doubt. To him, and to most people, what I was doing was a foolish waste of time. A widow's hobby. A few sheep on a played-out farm. It was tiring to feel that judgment, to have to defend work that was still unfinished, that had no results to show for itself yet. That fatigue settled deep in my bones during the winter of 1987. It was a brutal winter, with heavy snow and weeks of sub-zero temperatures. I'd had my first crop of lambs from my new ram the spring before. They were smaller than I was used to, but they were hardy. Still, I lost one of the foundation ewes and 2 of the new lambs to a sudden blizzard in late November. It was a gut punch. My flock was now just 24 animals. After all that work, I was smaller than when I started. One night in January, with the wind howling outside and rattling the window panes, I sat alone in the kitchen. The doubt was a cold knot in my stomach. I was exhausted. My hands were raw from the winter chores. The money from the hardware store job barely covered the bills. I looked at my own books, the careful records I was keeping. The numbers were pitiful. I had spent so much time, so much effort, for a net loss of 3 animals. Sterling's voice was in my head. Tinkering. Was that all this was? A sentimental game. I got up and went into the study. I took out my grandfather's flock book. The leather was cool in my hands. I sat back down at the kitchen table and opened it to the inside cover. The faded blue ink seemed to glow in the warm light from the lamp. The value isn't in what you shear off. It's in what you leave on the bone. I read it over and over. He had faced hard winters. He had lost sheep. He had dealt with low prices and droughts. It was all there in his notes. But he hadn't wavered. He was playing a long game. A generational game. He was building something that couldn't be measured in a single season's profits. He was building the flock itself. The bone. I looked at my own hands, chapped and calloused. I was tired, yes, but the work was honest. The sheep were healthy. The plan was sound. I decided right then to trust the slow process. I would trust my grandfather. I would trust the bone. The spring of 1988 was the turning point. The year-old lambs from my special ram, the ones who had survived the winter, were ready for their first shearing. As I brought them into the newly rebuilt shed, one by one, I could already see a difference. Their fleece was denser, longer. When I tipped the first one and ran the electric shears through the wool, it was like nothing I had ever experienced. The fleece peeled off in a single, cohesive blanket. It wasn't greasy and clumped like the old wool. It was soft, with a bright, buttery color. The lanolin content was high, and the smell, rich and earthy, filled the small shed. I took each fleece to the skirting table. I was unsparing. I pulled off all the lower quality bits, sometimes discarding a full quarter of the weight. What was left was the prime blanket, the heart of the fleece. It was beautiful. The crimp was so tight and regular you could see it from across the room, like a tiny, perfect accordion. I packed each of the 12 prime fleeces from the yearlings into its own separate plastic bag, labeled with the use number. All summer I worked with that wool. I took small samples and washed them by hand. The clean fiber was luminous. I bought a pair of hand carders and a small spinning wheel from a woman in the next county. I taught myself to spin. The yarn I produced was fine, strong, and incredibly soft. It was a world away from the coarse, scratchy yarn I remembered from my childhood. I knitted a small swatch. It was springy and warm, with a wonderful feel against the skin. The evidence was no longer just a theory in a 100-year-old book. It was here. It was real, tangible proof I could hold in my hands. The work was proving itself. By the spring of 1989, I had a new crop of lambs, and the fleeces from my 2-year-old ewes were even better than the year before. The flock had grown to 35 head. It was still a tiny operation by any commercial standard, but the quality of what I was producing was undeniable. I knew I had something special, but I had no idea what it was worth, or if anyone in the modern world would even care. I was just a woman on an old farm with a few bags of wool. Elias suggested I contact the state university. They had a well-respected textile and fiber arts program. I was hesitant. These were academics, scientists. What would they think of my grandfather's handwritten notes and my strange, old-fashioned methods? But I knew I needed an objective eye. I needed a neutral verifier. I picked out the 3 best fleeces from my shearing. They weighed about 8 pounds each after skirting. I packed them carefully into a cardboard box and made an appointment with a Dr. Eris Thorne, a professor of fiber science. I drove the 2 hours to the university, my old truck feeling out of place among the new cars in the campus parking lot. Dr. Thorne's lab was a clean, white, modern space. It smelled of chemicals and machinery, a stark contrast to the lanolin and hay smell of my barn. She was a young woman, maybe 35, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an efficient, no-nonsense manner. She was polite but skeptical. I was, after all, just a farm wife with a box of wool. She probably saw a dozen like me every semester. "So," she said, gesturing for me to put the box on a steel table, "what have you brought us?" "Wool," I said simply. "From my Rambouillet flock." She opened the box and pulled out the first fleece. Her professional demeanor shifted slightly. She parted the wool with her fingers, her movements precise and practiced. She pulled a small lock of fibers and held it up to the light. She didn't say anything for a full minute. Then she went to the second fleece and the third. "The staple length is remarkable," she said, more to herself than to me. "Look at the uniformity. And the crimp. It's what you'd read about in historical texts, not what you see from a modern production flock." She took a sample from each of the 3 fleeces and went over to a bench that held a series of complex-looking machines. She prepared a slide for a powerful microscope. An image of the wool fibers appeared on a computer monitor next to it. The fibers were smooth, the scales on their surface lying flat and even. There was almost no variation in diameter. "All right," she said, her skepticism now replaced by intense curiosity. "Let's run a micron test." She placed another sample into a machine called an optical fiber diameter analyzer. It hummed quietly for a few moments, and then a series of numbers appeared on a small screen. Dr. Thorne stared at the screen. She ran the test again. The same numbers came up. She turned to look at me, her expression one of pure scientific confusion. "Your average micron count is 175, she said, as if announcing the discovery of a new element. 17.5, with a standard deviation of less than 3. Do you understand what that means?" I shook my head. "It means this is technically ultrafine wool. This is the quality of high-grade Saxon merino. But it's not merino. The staple length and crimp style are all wrong. It has the softness of cashmere but the strength and elasticity of the best Rambouillet. I've never seen a fleece like this. Commercially, this shouldn't exist. How did you produce this?" I told her everything. I told her about my grandfather, about the little green flock book, about his aphorism. I told her about the 27 culls, the slow culling process based on touch, the pasture rotation, the late shearing. I explained the whole system. She listened, her pen poised over a notepad, but she wrote nothing. She was trying to fit my story into her world of quantifiable data and scientific papers, and it just wouldn't go. My methods were anecdotal, unscientific, ancient, but the results were on her screen, undeniable and precise. A system of targeted nutrition and delayed shearing to increase fineness and grease content, she murmured, finally starting to write. combined with a multi-generational breeding program selecting for specific fiber characteristics over frame size. She looked up at me. What you've done here, Mrs. Lambert. You've preserved something. Or maybe you've recreated it. This is living history. She asked if she could keep the fleeces for further study. She said she knew of a few small, high-end textile mills back east, places that catered to couture designers and artisan weavers. They were constantly searching for unique, high-performance natural fibers. She told me this wool was too good for the commodity market. Selling it by the pound would be like selling a diamond as a piece of gravel. She said she would make some calls. When I left the university that day, the world felt different. The sun was shining, and the 2-hour drive home felt like a victory parade. I hadn't just been validated. My grandfather had been. His patient, careful wisdom had been proven right by the most modern instruments available. News travels fast in a small town. Dr. Thorne published a small piece about my flock in a university agricultural journal. A writer from a statewide farming magazine came out and did a story. It wasn't a big, splashy article, but people read it. People started talking. One Saturday, a few weeks later, I was out mending a fence when Dale's truck pulled into the drive. He was the neighbor who had helped load my sheep out 6 years earlier. He'd bought 20 of my best ewes at that auction. I knew for a fact his flock, mixed with sterlings, was now producing the same coarse, commodity-grade wool as everyone else's. He got out of his truck and walked over to the fence, looking at my small flock grazing peacefully in the pasture. They were beautiful animals now, uniform, healthy, calm. He stood there for a long time just watching. "Heard you got something special there, Martha," he finally said, not quite looking at me. "It's good wool," I said. "Yeah," he said. He nodded slowly. My grandfather used to talk about wool like that. We all thought he was just telling stories. He kicked at a dirt clod with the toe of his boot. "You kept the right ones, didn't you?" It wasn't an apology. It was something more. It was an admission, a recognition. He knew what I had done, and he knew what he and the others, in their rush for the biggest and the quickest, had thrown away. I just nodded. He got back in his truck and drove off. It was the only conversation we ever had about it, and it was enough. The doubters had turned. The final piece fell into place a month later. A letter arrived with a postmark from Vermont. It was from one of the artisanal mills Dr. Thorne had contacted. They had tested the samples she sent. They were ecstatic. They wanted to buy my entire 1989 wool clip. And they weren't offering to pay by the pound. They offered a price by the clean ounce. The letter contained a contract. They were offering $4.25 an ounce for my prime, skirted fleece. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I had weathered my night of doubt, and did the math. My clip from that spring was about 220 pounds of raw fleece. After skirting and cleaning, I figured I'd have about 140 pounds of premium fiber. 140 pounds. It sounded so small. But then I did the final calculation. 140 pounds is 2,240 ounces. I multiplied that by $425. The number that appeared on my notepad made my breath catch in my throat. $9,520. From a flock of 35 sheep. It was more money than my original herd of 200 had sold for at the auction. It was more than I made in 2 years at the hardware store. It was enough to pay my property taxes for the next decade. It was a harvest. A quiet, stunning resolution. The irony was not lost on me. While I was slowly, carefully building value, Mr. Sterling had been doing the opposite. The farm crisis of the 80s had hit the local banks hard. Sterling had tried to outsmart it by buying up foreclosed assets on the cheap, land, equipment, and livestock, including my sheep, expecting the market to rebound quickly so he could sell them at a profit. But the market stayed flat. He was overleveraged, holding a portfolio of underperforming assets he'd bought with the bank's money. The story in the farming magazine about my flock became a local legend. People started calling my sheep the Lambert Jewels. The story that got told over and over at the coffee shop was how the bank president had auctioned off a fortune in genetics for $65 a head, and left the real prize, the scrubs, behind for the widow to find. He wasn't seen as a shrewd businessman anymore. He was seen as a fool, a man who couldn't tell the difference between a rock and a diamond. His board of directors, facing their own financial pressures, lost faith in his judgment. That fall, the local paper ran a small article on the business page announcing Mr. Sterling's early retirement. He wasn't destroyed in a blaze of glory. He was simply undone. His reputation for sharp dealing was ruined by a quiet woman, a dusty old book, and 27 sheep nobody wanted. I never saw him again. His Lincoln disappeared from the streets of our town. The big house he'd built out on the highway went up for sale. His undoing was as quiet and methodical as my own victory. Today, the flock is up to 100 ewes. All of them descendants of the 12 foundation mothers I chose from those original 27. I have a waiting list of handspinners and weavers from all over the world who buy my wool every year. I never got big. I just got better. I had the contract from the Vermont mill framed, and it hangs in the study right next to a photograph of my grandfather. Every year, when I enter the new lambs into my own flock book, I write their lineage and I make my own notes in the margins, just like he did. I am continuing the conversation he started almost 100 years ago. Sometimes, in the evening, I walk out to the pasture and just watch them graze as the light fades. The air smells of grass and lanolin. It's the smell of real wealth. Not the kind you see in a bank ledger, but the kind you build, fiber by fiber, season by season. The kind you hold in your hands. My grandfather was right. The value isn't in what you shear off. It's in what you leave on the bone. It's the genetics, the knowledge, the patience. It's the stubborn belief that the old, slow ways sometimes know a truth that the fast new world has forgotten. I wonder what difficult ground you've been given, what overlooked inheritance you might be standing on. Let me know in the comments. There's a lot of wisdom in the things people throw away.